Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our webinar, and thank you so much for joining us today. Before we begin, I'd just like to let you know that our speakers today will do the acknowledgement of country for us. And I wanted to just do a little bit of housekeeping before we begin. So following the presentation, we've built in time for Q&A. So we'll do our best to answer as many of the questions that you sent in to us prior to this session, but please do drop your questions into the Q&A chat as we go. We'll be monitoring them and asking them throughout the session. Also, this session will be recorded and posted on our website for those that are interested in reviewing it or sharing it with others following the session.
Yes, as Georgia said, welcome to everyone that's joined us today. We're really excited to explore a pressing topic facing HR and business leaders right now: how to strengthen psychosocial safety, prevent escalations, and manage psychosocial risks in the workplace. Today's session will move beyond frameworks and compliance to unpack what's happening inside workplaces, where issues start, how they escalate, and what HR managers can do earlier to reduce risk, conflict, and turnover. Joining us from Ompoint are two experienced practitioners who live and breathe this work every day. Lindall West, founding managing director of Ompoint and chief people officer at L1 Group. Lindall is a seasoned C-suite HR leader with over 20 years experience across listed private financial services organizations. She founded Ompoint, Australia's first workplace conflict support and early intervention service, to help organizations resolve issues before they escalate into investigations, claims, or culture damage. And we also have alongside Lindall, Holly Wilson, advisor at Ompoint. Holly is an experienced HR practitioner whose background spans across multiple industries. She specializes in communication, change management, coaching people through conflict and psychosocial challenges. Holly brings a grounded, real-world perspective of the issues and trends facing people and the workplace. Thank you, Lindall and Holly.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Thank you. Great. And that was one of our wonderful advisors, Jess, who works with us. She comes from a First Nations background, as you could tell, and she really offers, I guess, for many of our clients, the opportunity to have support that is very much aligned to the different communities and backgrounds that we have our callers come through. So look, thank you everyone for coming along today. I thought what I'd do is just start to give you a little bit of background about what Ompoint is, if you're not aware of us, just because it will help to context some of the comments that Holly and I will make around the types of calls and interactions that we have. So what we are is an early intervention service for workplace conflict. Lots of people ask us whether we do mediation, whether we do investigations, all of those sorts of things. We don't. we're very much if I can call us the chemist in the resolution. When you've got the niggly throat or the upset stomach, we're the people that you come to get the support and skills and confidence to be able to actually address the issues. When things do escalate, as they sometimes do, and certain issues do need to escalate, they sort of go on to the internal HR teams or other frames. But very much for us, it's about getting in early, giving people the skills and confidence, and being able to solve issues. We've been around for about 4 years, and during that time, we've worked with a range of organisations. And as Matt just said, my background is very much financial services, and I sort of did wonder how this would resonate. But what we'll do is just share some of the insights that we've seen in the last 12 months. And to that point, even the fact that I've been in financial services most of my career, what we see is same issues. People are people everywhere. Our number one issue that we see is interpersonal conflict. I like to call it garden variety conflict, because it's very much, that person spoke to me and I didn't like the way that it happened. Somebody stole my lunch from the fridge and I'm really aggrieved. Or it could be that, I got some performance feedback that I didn't like and so forth, and that's causing me challenges with my manager. So what we see is same industry, different industries, but the same challenges across the full range of for people. I think one of the really interesting things is that despite the fact that we have some male-dominated industries that we work with, people like tugboat operators, we've got mining companies, women are far more likely to reach out. So what we see is with our stats that the majority of people that we speak to are actually women, just regardless of the sort of industry. We also work in areas like education, where it's obviously much more female dominated, but across the board, females are more likely to ask for help. The next thing that we see in terms of our stats is September surge. The advisors, Holly will be able to talk to this even in more detail, but I think that September is that point in the year where people think it's not quite the end of the year, how am I going to get there? But things have escalated in my workplace where this is just becoming unsustainable, or I just can't sort of see myself being able to get to the end of the year. Often it's also off the back of end of financial year, I guess, for many organisations. So whether that's been pressure around staffing numbers, or whether it's actually just the fact that, as I say, you're 3/4 of the way through the year and people are really starting to see that burnout piece. So our call volumes really peak through that period. The fourth thing that we've really seen this year, and this has been something that's probably been, I think, something that we've seen specifically this year. We haven't seen it as much in previous years of operation, but there's been a real sense of economic pressure. And I guess many of the people on the call today are probably feeling that themselves. Lots of restructuring, lots of organisations sort of becoming much more vigilant around how they use performance management and both in the selection decisions for redundancy, I guess, but also in terms of getting people to be doing more. And we're seeing that with managers as well, because managers are really grappling with, I guess, how do you do more, but at the same time, manage all of these different things that are coming together. So psychosocial risks, which we'll absolutely touch on. I like to say, the term psychosocial risks has become the new bullying. And I don't say that flippantly, obviously, but, 2 or 3 years ago, almost every call or every second call that came to us, it was very much around, I'm being bullied. People have replaced that terminology now with psychosocial risks. And I think some of the reason that they've changed those terms is actually because people have become more familiar with bullying and what bullying is and what it isn't. And I think we're still going through that evolution at the moment around psychosocial risks and what it actually means. On top of that, we've obviously had other legislative changes, things like respect at work, needing to demonstrate that positive duty. And as I said, very much linked to point number 4 there, which is, managers are asked to do more with less. So it really is a convergence of all of those factors coming into some of the conversations that we have with people.
Yeah.
So, Paul, maybe if you can take us back a little bit and talk about what psychosocial risks are and hazards in your workplace.
Yeah, so we really want today to be practical, and we'll probably refer to a lot of case studies that we're dealing with on the front line. But I thought it was worthwhile just taking a step back and actually just doing a quick recap and refresh on psychosocial hazards and the landscape in Australia. So firstly, what are psychosocial hazards? So they are factors in the workplace that can, have damage to people's mental health. So things like very high or very low job demands, poor management support or supervision, the behavioural stuff that Lindall was just referring to, bullying, conflict, harassment, exposure to trauma, low role clarity, poor change management, things like that. I think the important thing to note is that, I guess if you look at that list, or just even, the few that I just said there, the immediate response is, well, those are just factors that we all have to deal with working in 2025, no matter what organisation you're working for. And it's not those factors on their own that have the impact. It's when they're actually, when they interact and compound over time. So, for example, the first one I mentioned there, very high job demands. I might be in an extremely stressful role. I might have very demanding clients. I might have very, stretched sales targets, but I have an extremely good supportive manager who, is a really good communicator and supports me no matter what. I have, very high role clarity and agency over my job. I work in a really good team where there's no bullying or, minimal conflict that occurs. So even though I have that high job demand, I have a number of other factors in the workplace that I feel supported by. Where we see it play out as a hazard and a risk is when, for example, I might be a paramedic working in the ambulance service, so I'm exposed to trauma every day. I have a manager who's really absent and really unsupportive. We've had a lot of team changeovers. There's low role clarity. People aren't sure how we work together as a team. And, on top of that, it's a really unhealthy, toxic workplace culture, and there's a lot of bullying and conflict that goes unresolved. So you can see, obviously, if all those factors interact and then compound over time, how damaging it could be to somebody's mental health. So we've seen strengthening in workplace laws over the last 2 years in particular, as Lindall referred to, and those laws are now introduced into the WHS legislation. And really the key principle around this is around proactive intervention as opposed to reactive. So we really need to be treating those risks and hazards in the same way that we do physical risks and hazards. So it's proactive identification of what those hazards are, either controlling them or eliminating them, if at all possible, and being really proactive in terms of addressing them so that they're not going to escalate. Linda, did you just want to talk about, I think everybody on this call would appreciate that we want to have a psychologically safe workplace for our employees' well-being, but this is actually also really impacting the bottom line.
Yeah. And again, as I said earlier, organisations are focused on that bottom line. Just as an example, I work with a not-for-profit organisation, and our workers' comp premiums have doubled in the last 12 months. And largely driven by not substantiated claims in workers' compensation, but sort of incidents around psychosocial type issues. And I think organisations are finding that increasingly problematic. Some of the stats here are really quite alarming, I guess, in terms of just the amount of time it takes to get somebody back to work. And with one of the organisations that we work with, I think it's really interesting. We see that for people who have been off on workers' compensation, which is a clearly valid piece, there's also this piece around how do they come back into the workplace. Now, often we see, they've got sort of psychological support. We also see that they've got, return to work officers to say, you can work 2 days or you can work 3 days. But we see in a very practical way, how do you come back into the workplace and actually reintegrate when the person that you're reporting to is the person that you made the allegations of bullying about, or you come back into the team environment and your team are saying, well, where have you been for the last 6 months? And so I think more and more, in order to reduce these numbers, organisations do need to do exactly what you've said, Hol, which is around just reducing and being proactive around the actions that people are taking to actually address some of these pieces. And I think Treasury sort of said something along the lines of they expect that in the next 3 years, there's going to be an escalation even further of the costs associated with these pieces.
Yeah, and I think what terrifies me more about these numbers is these are just the numbers reported due to workers' compensation claims. This isn't actually the real cost to businesses in terms of time lost due to personal leave or, loss of productivity, in terms of disengagement if people are, feeling, I guess, mentally unwell at work. So, yeah, it really is impacting the bottom line, I think.
And as we talked about the other day, there's certainly people, I think, today who, given some of these economic factors, are potentially, not moving roles. They're not reaching out to new organisations, and so they're sort of stuck in their current employer, being not as productive as they can be. As you said, being exposed to some of these risks, and what we're seeing is that impacts on morale and impacts on outcomes as well.
Yeah. So I guess now, I think Lindall and I will probably go into a bit more of a conversational format and talk about what we're actually seeing on the front line. We've set the scene. So I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about what, I'm an advisor at Ompoint, so I take a lot of the calls every day. And I just wanted to talk about the reality of what we're seeing about how this legislation change and some of these factors are playing out. About 30% of the people who call through to us are managers trying to navigate some of these issues. So I guess the observations I can make generally are, after 2 years of the legislation being in place, I think it's safe to say most managers understand what their positive duty obligations are around managing psychosocial hazards in the workplace. But in practice and in reality, what I'm seeing is there's a fear and a hesitation around, how do I balance and manage my day-to-day team management in terms of holding people to account, in terms of performance standards, having those difficult conversations if things aren't going, in the way that I expect, consequence management, all of that kind of, I guess, managing the team in an economic environment like we have today, as well as balancing the requirement to obviously be empathetic and to be caring, but without kind of blurring those boundaries between causing a psychosocial risk in my team. I think there's also a perception from managers that maybe some of the psychosocial language is being used or weaponized, if I can use that very loaded term, in their conversations with their employees when things do get a bit difficult or uncomfortable, maybe as a way of people avoiding those situations and or, trying to avoid being held to account, for example, if it's a performance management issue.
I think we hear a lot managers talking about, I'm walking on eggshells.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. I don't know whether I should take this forward. Again, I had a call the other day and the manager said, I really need to provide this feedback, but I think what I'll do is just wait a couple of months.
Yeah.
And, the counterbalance to that is, well, why? What are you going to achieve by waiting a couple of months? And when we spoke about this particular issue, the manager was like, well, I just feel like, it's quite tense at the moment. In a couple of months, it won't be. But in a couple of months, it'll be way less relevant as well. So what's the conversation that you actually need to have to enable you to provide the feedback in a timely manner? Because you can just imagine the other person's reaction, which is, why are you telling me this when, we talked about this in May?
Yeah.
So I think managers are really hesitant,
yeah.
and they're really grappling with their multiple responsibilities.
Yeah. And I think also for the employees that are calling through to us looking for support and guidance if they're going through some difficult situations at work, and again, I'm talking generally, but what we're seeing is the terms like I'm feeling psychologically unsafe, or I'm being bullied, or I'm being harassed. I think those terms are often, not always, but often misused and overused in the context of workplace discussions, particularly if it's those more difficult or uncomfortable discussions that we all face every day. And I think people are misinterpreting the feeling of discomfort or being stretched out of their comfort zone as feeling psychologically unsafe. So I guess the support that we offer, I guess, firstly, if I talk about managers, first of all, it's giving them the confidence, as you said, to have those conversations, not to avoid them, because as we all know, if we avoid things and sweep things under the carpet, they're going to get worse and or escalate. Really giving them the confidence around what is reasonable management action or direction versus bullying, in case that allegation or those kind of terms come up during the conversation. And just, again, basic coaching on how you can set yourself up for success in terms of managing the situation, having the conversation in a really safe way, in a constructive way, in a really clear and transparent way, and just giving them the confidence to do that. Similarly, with employees, it's about giving them the confidence to actually deal with the situation rather than turn away and avoid it. So giving them the confidence to have those discussions. What is it? What reasonable adjustments do you need? If you are genuinely feeling uncomfortable or psychologically unsafe talking with your manager, what adjustments could you ask for? So it might be having a support person in the room or HR present. It might be for the manager to give them an agenda and some discussion items of what's going to be spoken about in the meeting so that they feel really prepared when they come in as to what's going to be discussed, all of those types of things. So it's giving them the confidence to actually hopefully deal with the situation early rather than turn away and avoid it. Because I think what we see is if people do avoid it, the situation gets worse and potentially they end up going on personal leave or extended stress leave, or even worse, or in more serious situations, take the workers' compensation pathways. And I think we've seen, that necessarily doesn't achieve a good outcome
as well. Yeah, I mean, when you were talking about that, about addressing things early, I was taken back to one of the calls that you had, Hol, where Holly said to the individual, how long have you worked with the organisation? And the individual said, 17 years. And then Holly sort of said, well, how long have you worked with this particular individual that you've got the issue with? And they said, 17 years. And then I think you went into, well, at what point in that relationship then did things deteriorate? And the individual was like 17 years ago.
Yeah.
And we sort of marvel at the fact that somebody is prepared to turn up every day to that workplace and, continue on working with that person and have a really unproductive relationship. I mean, just a couple of other things that I'd just touch on is, a lot of what we're talking about is not brain surgery. I like to say that a lot. What we're talking about is really practical things. Are you actually catching your manager at a time when they've just walked out of a meeting and they're walking into the next one? Is that going to be the productive time to get across your message? Is it framed in a way that's going to be effective? Again, another call that we've debriefed on, the individual said, well, I'm just going to tell the individual that they're wrong. And the advisor said, okay, let's just pause for a moment. When you're told that you're wrong, how do you react? And the individual was like, well, I'm rarely wrong, but I don't react that well. And so being able to kind of get people to see things from a different perspective is also, I guess, part of the, if I can call it magic, of dealing with some of these psychosocial risks that we're seeing in the workplace and how it translates into outcomes.
Yeah.
So Lindall and Holly, sorry to interrupt. We have just had a question just in terms of how you coach, or what would you recommend for a manager on how they can handle a situation where they know the feedback they're about to give may trigger a defensive or an emotional response? What's that kind of practical piece that you'd give them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I coach managers a lot on this, so I'm happy to answer that. I think the first thing is you cannot underestimate the value of preparation for that discussion.
Yeah.
So really think through and prepare for, what am I going to say? How am I going to say it? I say write it down, practice it out loud, use a service like Ompoint if you need a sounding board to kind of practice how you're going to deliver that message. I think the second thing is, if you are anticipating those types of objections, and I had a call this week, so the manager was giving performance feedback and the employee responded really defensively, really emotionally, and basically said, you're singling me out, you're bullying me, and things like that. So my advice is stay calm. Obviously, that person's responding in an emotional and defensive way, so you need to, obviously remain calm and remain professional. I think the second thing is, don't go down the rabbit hole of trying to defend the allegation. So try not to become defensive yourself. So an allegation doesn't, mean wrongdoing necessarily, but rather you can still validate their feelings without, I guess, confirming the allegation. So you can say, look, I can see you're really upset. I can see this feedback's, difficult for you to take, but reinforce your intention. My intention is not to single you out or to bully you or to target you. Really, my intention is to give you this feedback so we can course correct and I can help you get back on track before it goes on for much longer. Obviously, there's a tipping point in the discussion. If you can de-escalate the situation and get that person again focused on the intention of the feedback and hopefully listen a bit more reciprocally, that's a good thing. If it spirals and if that individual is absolutely completely shut down, very, very emotional, not willing to engage in a professional way, you may decide that it's a good time to end the conversation, and end it in a safe way. Make sure that they know they've got the support they need. Make sure you check in on them. If they're incredibly emotional, you might want to send them home for the day, whatever is the appropriate action. But my message is, please pick that conversation back up. Don't close it down and say, that was horrible. They called me a bully. This is, it's too much for me. The worst thing you can do is leave it. Make sure you pick it up at the soonest practical time that you can, whether that's the next morning or the next day, whatever it is. And hopefully that person again is maybe in a position to listen to the feedback a bit more openly, or they've had some time to calm down, or they may say, look, can I bring a support person on, whatever the situation is, but please don't leave it open and just ignore it and sweep it under the carpet.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is, you've also got to reflect on the fact that particularly with some of these behaviours, others in the team can see it as well. So often managers feel like they're doing the right thing by shutting down the conversation and like, that was a bit tricky, I'm stepping away from that. But the reality is others in the team will see that behaviour and either think, well, the boundaries have changed, or that's acceptable behaviour and why am I working so hard? So by not dealing with it, not only are you not dealing with the issue that you've got at hand, you're potentially creating a whole range of other issues as well in the team environment. And one of the things that we like to pick up on are those trends of what's going on. And I think what we sometimes see is where people are not having the conversation with the actual person, they're often having it with other people in the team. And it's sort of a cancerous process where people are opinion shopping around the team, and that doesn't lead to a conducive environment either.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question here. How have the recent legislative changes impacted organisations' approach to psychosocial risks and kind of the preventative measures they've been taking on?
Well, I think at the very beginning, I can answer and then, jump in, Lindall. I think obviously when the legislation was first introduced, there was a flurry of education, awareness and training, particularly for those frontline managers, to get them across what the changes are and I guess what their obligations are. And then I think, and again, I'm speaking generally, but I think organisations were also very good at getting those systems and policies in place in terms of the reporting and the documentation, and kind of incorporating that into their existing WHS systems for reporting and tracking those hazards. But I think once that happened, there was a bit of a lull, as happens with all of these changes, where then it kind of went into the drawer, or, you know, it wasn't the hot topic at the time. And that's, I think, when I started to see maybe managers needing more support about, okay, I understand what I need to do, and I've got the documentation and the reporting, you know, templates that I need to do, but how am I actually manage? This is actually complex in reality. And comments like, well, I'm not a psychologist and I'm not a GP, so how am I supposed to deal with this? That's where that fear and trepidation came in. And I think, again, reassuring them that they don't need to be a qualified psychologist or psychiatrist. It's about, you know, a common sense approach. It's about what's reasonably practical. And again, it's about actually leaning into it and asking the question and addressing it, as opposed to maybe what we used to do culturally is turn a bit of a blind eye or hope it'll resolve itself, or even, you know, look, that's somebody's personal business. I don't want to cross the boundary. That's not my, you know, that's not my question to ask. So I think, you know, as managers get more comfortable with it and the legislation, you know, we're over 2 years on now, hopefully managers are getting more comfortable, but I think there was, yeah, an initial flurry and kind of activity around psychosocial legislations, then maybe it was actually the reality of how we manage it started to hit home.
I mean, I think the other thing that I'd say is there's been a bit of a confluence of issues. You know, I often hear people say to us, I've read the policy, but it doesn't help me to address this particular issue. And I think actually we've got one of our great advisors, Lynn, on the call today. She's our neurodiverse specialist. And so what we're seeing is, as I say, a bit of a confluence of issues. So it might be a performance issue, which the manager goes, yep, I know how to deal with that, but I actually need to deal with it in a way that's respectful to the neurodiverse employee, or maybe I'm neurodiverse myself and I need some support around how to do that. And so I think what we're seeing is exactly what Holly said, which is we've moved away from that compliance element and now having to do the nuance piece. I mean, the other thing that I made some comments on LinkedIn this week around is we're now starting to see a lot of people go, I've been to ChatGPT and ChatGPT tells me to do this. And I think that's great. And I'm certainly not bagging AI, because we had a great session with Tandem a month or so ago on that. But I think there is nuance here. There is that human element, and maybe one day AI will do it. But when you're not looking at the person, or you're actually, you know, saying things in a manner that actually aggravates the situation, it's not going to get resolved easily. It's potentially going to escalate it. So actually being able to take people's sort of ChatGPT and go, let's talk about how that's going to work in your unique set of circumstances is important as well.
How interesting. You mentioned a September surge in the beginning of the conversation in terms of burnout and performance pressure for employees. What would you recommend organisations or managers do to proactively mitigate that kind of seasonal spike?
Yeah, look, I think it is, again, a result of a number of different things. So performance management cycles in Australia, particularly with sort of financial years ending June, often end up in that space. I think, look, it's probably generic, and maybe, you've got something better to add, but it is about managing the workforce, the workload, and the team dynamic throughout the year. Because what September is really doing is just saying, actually, it's culminating. All of the things that we haven't addressed today are actually kind of starting to get to the point where it's actually too much. And, you know, look, at something that I talk to the CPOs that we work with a lot about is the incidents that we're seeing is the stuff that's bubbling around underneath the surface. It's, you know, as I said at the beginning, we're kind of the chemist, where, you know, you don't know when you need a Panadol or a lozenge to deal with the issues. And I think, you know, boards and management teams aren't necessarily going to see that until it actually comes to, you know, how many cases you've got, how much turnover you've got. what your engagement scores have fallen to. They're the things that we currently measure, which are all outcomes of exactly what we're talking about here, which is this stuff that's bubbling around under the surface. And if it's not addressed, we'll ultimately end up in those spaces.
And I just think, even just frontline managers being aware that, look, we're almost at the end of the year, but we can't quite see the finish line yet. So just taking that extra care and caution around, just checking in with your team. You can feel when tensions, you can feel it when you're working with the team day in and day out, when people are starting to get a bit tense or there might be a snide remark. So I think just to be a bit more hyper aware around that September, October time, check in with your team. Guys, I know we're all feeling really tired. What can we do to maybe give ourselves a break or deprioritize something to next year, because, we're almost at the end, but we're feeling the burnout. So it's just those practical, just being maybe a bit more proactive around checking in and putting a bit more care around how people are feeling and their mental health.
I mean, one organisation that I was working with last week, they actually had indicated that they'd had a spike in sick leave around the sort of September period. And it's interesting because I think all of us would experience since COVID, sick leave has sort of dropped away because, where we used to drag ourselves into the office and cough and splutter over people, we don't anymore. But often we're not sick enough not to work, but we'll just do a few hours or a reduced day or something. This organisation had actually seen a spike in sick leave, and that was an indication for them that perhaps some of this stuff that we're talking about in terms of the September surge was just kind of bubbling around, and so very much started to try and address that in the ways that Holly sort of talked about.
So interesting.
Thank you. We have another question by Alison. How have you seen restructures and inorganic activity contribute to psychosocial risk? So how do you support through this uncertainty?
This is a really interesting question. And I guess for those of you following the media as well, there's been two prominent universities in New South Wales that have actually received prohibition orders to halt their restructuring process because it's posing significant psychosocial risks to the people involved. And it's that kind of age-old adage, don't consult at people, consult with people. So again, I think particularly with restructuring, factoring in the psychosocial risk just can't be a sidebar or an HR activity that we kind of do on the side. It actually has to be fundamentally a really serious and considerable part of the restructuring process. And I think the people managing it, the frontline managers, need to be really aware of that. And again, it's about really considering your consultation mechanisms, giving employees a real voice, and hand on heart, I've been involved in many, many, many restructures over my long HR career. And sometimes, historically, it has a bit felt like we've consulted at people and we've ticked that box, and now the decision's been made, but we're letting you know, and you've got 7 days to come back to us. But everyone knows, that the decision's been made. I don't think we can do that anymore. And the regulators are, proving that they're forcing us to do that.
Yeah, look, I think the other thing that we find is a lot of these formal processes as well are in themselves sort of triggers for the risks. I think we've been working with a number of organisations, and sometimes even simple things like somebody's told their role's being made redundant, then they're essentially put on gardening leave that particular day. They've got no access to their systems, they've got no access to the information, they've got no access to the support mechanisms through that process. Can also be it can be difficult. One organisation we work with, they actually have a lot of international transfers, and what we found was that there was different applications being applied to different people for similar circumstances. Now, I'm an advocate of, working with what you've got, but that in itself was causing angst and people feeling really aggrieved by the process. So I think there's, again, that was a situation where we said to the organisation, we think actually people didn't feel like they were being heard when they were raising some of these issues. So I think it is really about thinking about every aspect of that process and trying as much as possible to think through how the recipient's going to experience it and what support you might need to put around it to ensure that you're not into this space.
Yeah, I just think giving an EAP pamphlet as part of the consultation process isn't going to cut it anymore.
Absolutely. Another question we've got is managing these types of matters will create an overlap between HR and WHS in a situation where a misconduct outcome may create a psychosocial hazard risk. Do you have any advice on navigating a way forward for that or how you'd support the leader?
I probably should have said it up front. One of the things that we don't do is come back into the organisation and advocate for the person. It is a confidential service. We are independent. If the person wants to come back into the organisation, it is very much for them to do. And as Holly has said, we give them the skills and the confidence to do that. But we're never coming in and saying, look, Marion accounts, she's got an issue with something. So very much it is around getting them to have the skills to come back in, position the conversation appropriately. So I don't think there is an overlap, and having my dual roles of a CPO and Ompoint, I don't think we're overlapping with the HR team. I think what we're doing is providing an alternate source of support for people to actually address these psychosocial risks so that they don't become bigger. Again, as I said to a client, one of our clients said, yeah, but I have lots of people coming to me and talking to me about issues, will they just come to you instead? And I said, well, if they already feel comfortable coming to you, they're going to keep coming to you. They're not going to ring some independent hotline. Mm-hmm. But there's going to be people in your organisation, just like there's people in my organisation and in previous organisations I've worked for, that probably didn't feel comfortable coming to me because they thought, too close to Holly, who's my manager, or, I've seen them talking in the hallway or whatever it might be. And so giving people that independent and confidential space where they can explore the issue, decide what their course of action is going to be before they step into it, I think is important.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Emma's asked a question. Now, you've already touched on some support for managers dealing with complex situations, but this question is sometimes leaders can shut down when the word psychosocial risk or an employee feeling unsafe is raised by the employee. Yeah. So how do we empower leaders to be confident to face these conversations and not be scared themselves to have the conversation?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And as I said, I deal with it every day. And, I said before, about 30% of managers are calling us for exactly that reason. So I think, again, it's giving them, first of all, coaching them that shutting down and avoiding it is not the answer, and giving them reassurance that it's absolutely their duty and obligation to manage these situations. And it's not about not managing it, it's about how you go about managing it. So again, giving them that confidence around, okay, how are you going to frame the discussion? What are you going to say? What are some of the objections that might come back at you in terms of bullying, and how you're going to kind of talk to that? How are you making that other individual comfortable? So is it reasonable to have a support person in the room, whether it's a HR representative or, a manager once removed, making sure that they're doing it in a safe way, that they're offering that person the reasonable adjustments, that they're offering support services like EAP or like Ompoint. So yeah, I think the big message is don't shut down and avoid it. You need to lean in and deal with it because it's only going to get worse, but giving them the confidence to do that and giving them the tools to be able to do that in a more confident way. I think we do that every day.
I mean, I think in fairness, people like Holly and our other advisors spend a lot of time role playing with people. So our average call time is 53 minutes. And so for the HR practitioners who are on the call today, when somebody says, have you got 5 minutes? What they mean is 53. Yeah. But the work that we do around role playing and coaching and so forth, and getting people to practice the words out loud that they're going to use, is really important actually in terms of addressing some of these things where, you know, you might use a term that sort of comes to you that says, you know, your misconduct. Immediately that gets people's you know, on edge. And so some of the role playing that the advisors do is actually about helping them perhaps choose different language or choose different ways of framing the conversation.
Fantastic. In terms of, you know, any advice that you'd give to HR teams, I guess more broadly, about how they can effectively assess, you know, psychosocial risks without kind of overwhelming managers with that kind of compliance piece, would you give kind of any hints or tips, I guess, to teams to kind of do that well?
I mean, I'll just start by saying, I think one of the delightful but unintended consequences that we've found from the Ompoint service is that we do actually have a lot of our HR directors or CPOs actually use us for advice themselves. Right. It's a pretty lonely job at the top, and again, you know, it's hard to sort of find someone that you can bounce suggestions and solutions off. It's also, you know, sometimes the issues are in your team, and so therefore it's quite difficult to get that sounding board, that advice, etc. as well. So we do provide pretty regularly actually advice and support to some of the CPOs and heads of HR, etc. that we actually work with, and
senior partners,
and you know, senior leaders,
senior leaders in the business too.
Yeah, I had one call. It's probably 12 months ago now, and it was a major consulting firm, and two partners got on and they quizzed me for about 15 minutes, firstly about what I knew about their organisation. Seemingly I passed because they then proceeded to talk about the team dynamics that they had. And again, sort of the feedback at that point was, it's really helpful to have someone who understands our organisation but is not in it, and it doesn't feel like I'm escalating it beyond the situation, and, you know, taking it outside of the team. But it's great to get some suggestions and solutions on what I might be able to do differently. So I think, you know, back to the original question, which was what can CPOs do around psychosocial risks? I think it's about kind of going through that list that Holly shared at the beginning and going, which are the ones that are the most prevalent in our organisation, and is that changing on a regular basis? So I think somebody asked the question around, you know, mergers and acquisitions or restructuring. Some of these points are going to shift and change over time. Again, you know, one of the organisations we work with, when we first started working with them, they'd had a cultural review, and what we saw was that leaders were really trying to do things differently in terms of how they managed their people. Fast forward 2 years, they're economically struggling a bit more. There's been a lot of redundancies, and what we've seen is a reversion with managers to, if you like, much more directive management style, really sort of a bit more command and control. And, you know, we've seen that play out in terms of the way that individuals talk about it. They're like, yeah, I can see how that's a good conversation to have, but I'm fearful of having it. And so I think being, you know, cognizant of the situation that you're in and how things are evolving, and therefore based on kind of the list of psychosocial risks, which ones are the most prevalent at the moment, perhaps sort of pivoting to focus on those is maybe my best advice.
Right.
Thank you. Now, before we wrap up, I was just thinking, for those that don't know Ompoint that are listening to this discussion, is there anything that you wanted to mention about the services that you provide, the partnerships that you have, and any success that you've seen so far since you've launched?
Maybe I'll just start by saying this is not a new concept in the global environment. It is in Australia and New Zealand. We do support companies here in Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, PNG and Fiji. But the concept itself of ombudsing, and again, I'm not going to expect anybody on this call to know what that means, but is actually something that's been around for 30 or 40 years globally. And it's most prevalent in the US market, where big organisations often have these sorts of services in-house. I was actually at a global conference a couple of weeks ago, and one of the people there works for Boston Children's Hospital, bit niche, but they've got 18,000 employees. And for a lot of the organisations in this part of the world, we don't have workforces that large. And so this concept of ombudsing and early intervention and doing things in an informal, independent, confidential manner has been around for many years. And the research has shown that by actually addressing things in that manner can actually solve the issues before it escalates. So again, large universities, people like Northwestern Columbia, MIT, companies like Uber, McKinsey & Co, Maersk. So a real range of industries and companies have been using these sorts of frameworks for a while. And I guess that's where the genesis for Ompoint came from, because again, when I think back on you were generous when you said I'd been around 20 years, Matt, it's probably more closer to 30. If I think back on those times, the amount of times I've sat in front of two people and thought, you know what, if you two had a sensible conversation 6 months ago, we'd not be sitting here, is really the genesis for why the service exists.
Great, thank you.
Amazing.
Well, look, thanks, Lindall and Holly. That's such an insightful discussion, taking the time out to share your experience and insights and the Ompoint service model that you're providing. And thanks to everyone that's joined us today.
And for your questions, they've been great.
Yeah. So we hope today's conversation sparks some new ways of thinking to take back to your teams. And if you have any other further questions for Lindall and Holly, feel free to reach out to them directly. So on behalf of Tandem Partners, I really thank everyone for joining us, and we really look forward to hopefully seeing everyone in our next session.
Thank you, Lindall. Thank you, Holly.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.